Welcome back. I'm Kim Bailey, she's Fulyana Osborne, and we're continuing our discussion with Denis Gambi. We're talking about the qualities that we see and enjoy in business leaders. So when you're looking at the qualities that you see as ideal in business leaders, and you find some, or you find one or two that are ideal business leaders, do you gravitate towards where they're working?
Yeah, absolutely. you tend to do that. Yeah. All of a sudden you make that connection and you go, oh, this looks interesting. Want to get involved with that, or want to be a part of that journey, want to be a part of that potential success that might come with whatever it is we're trying to do. Mm-hmm.
Regardless of how hard the effort's going to be for you to do it, if it's got things where it's an industry that you're not so conversant with, or it's a physical location that you don't particularly want to be travelling to.
But that comes back to the risk. And ultimately what you value as the reward, whether it be personal or financial or whatever else it might be. It's that ability to assess that and go, you know what, this is actually worth giving it a go. Or no, I'm going to go back in my box and be happy where I am. Which, obviously a lot of people do. And there's nothing wrong with that. No. They understand where their boundaries are, and that's a good thing. But for those who want to take a bit of a risk, I think there's opportunity.
Now, in your career so far, you worked for a number of organisations. Is there a difference between those organisations?
Yeah, look, there's a lot of commonality, but typically there are a lot of differences. In walking into the organisations, one of the first things is, how does it function? What's its modus operandi? What's ultimately its culture? What are the things? How does it get things done? That's important for me because I like to achieve results. I like to actually get things done. So I need to get an understanding of how do they do that. And you need to also, in a large organisation, do understand politics. It exists, and you can't avoid it. Doesn't mean you necessarily have to always play along with it, but you need to at least have an appreciation. So it's that the ability to work within that. I think that's really important. So yes, there are many differences. The one that sticks out in my mind is, and I know it's a fairly casual. The cultural elements are really important. You don't get that in the first week or two. You really need to spend a good 90 days, 180 days to get the flavour of it, to get to understand how it is you can work within an organisation and actually make things happen. And there are elements of culture, there are elements of operation, elements of the behaviours and the values that the organisation lives by. There's those sort of things. Do they? Every organisation will have a set of values.
Yes.
Do they actually live them? Is it ingrained in what they do? Does it allow me to understand why they do the things they do? Some will and some won't.
So what sort of research do you do before you look at a new
opportunity? Aside from the obvious, which is the public available material, big websites, big newspapers, whatever, you go and find someone who's working in there.
Who's currently working there?
Who has worked, or who has worked there in the past, because you want to get an understanding of why did they leave, what were the things. Maybe it was just that they had a greater other opportunity. Maybe there's some issues with the organisation that would help knowing about. But certainly then finding contacts within the organisation that that's to me that's probably the number one way to get a sense of flavour of how the organisation functions and what are some of the issues that you potentially might face when you're working from a people perspective.
So if you put yourself on the other side of the table and you're looking for a senior executive to come in to the organisation, is there a place in the recruitment process for them to come in and have a day to wander around and talk to people?
It's an interesting idea. I haven't quite seen it.
I haven't seen it. I'm just interested to
see. I
haven't seen it in a business sense. I've seen it in other arenas, in a competitive sense, because I'm involved in some competition stuff, and often we, as competitors, we will be invited in before the competition to have a look at what other competitors are doing. The thinking behind it is that it gives you a sense of how much effort you need to put in, what the judges are going to be expecting. It also gives you a feeling of the venue itself. So the competition room, and if you haven't been there before, you get a bit more comfortable with where things are. So it's just a sort of it works both ways without you being on the spot.
Yeah, the closest I've gotten to that is in one organisation that I went to work for. They had gone through a substantial amount of restructuring, and the person that I was dealing with was looking to recruit the role I was going for. Once we got to virtually the end point, they said, look, I want you to go and have a chat to the consultant who did a lot of the work around the new structure, the reorganisation, They provided me the reports that the consultant provided, which were quite hefty, as you can imagine, and gave me an opportunity to go through all of that to see, and it was quite open in terms of the information they provided. You know, all the issues that they were facing were very well documented.
Which again is something that's interesting for you to take on board. They were that open about the issues that we're going to face.
It was virtually right at the end, though. So the notion of you down to the last 2 or 3, and then let's see how you. No, I haven't seen that in the past. Again, the only thing that comes close to it is if you do some form of testing, but that's again very stylised, very clinical. It doesn't put you into a position of knowledge of what the organisation's actually doing.
It has been done at, your question was about the senior levels, and my knowledge is the same as what you just covered. But in relation to, we mentor school, high school, final year, a lot of organisations do that. Like the executives take on that mentoring role. And in doing that, we bring them into what we call the office towers and get them to see what that looks like. So a global organisation, whether it's a law firm, whether it's a accountancy firm, a bank. And I was surprised is that, I didn't think about it before, but when we did do it, people were really appreciative. These students have not been. And you just think, oh, you go past the building all the time, but you don't know what's it look like on the inside. And when you walk them through each floor and say, this is operations, this is where people deal with the clients, this is where the front counter is, or whatever it is, it makes more sense to them. So I guess there's room throughout that. Particularly then the next stage will be the graduates. You know how there's a lot of graduate programs. And we could, before we pick the graduates, maybe we could show them so they can choose whether they want to go to company A, B or C. But at executive level, I like what happened with you, and I think there's more room for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is. And look, when you asked the question, I was thinking, you know, when you look at the recruitment process, hasn't changed that much.
No, it hasn't.
How many years?
And you know, that's probably something that really needs a paradigm shift, because industry itself has changed so much. You know, why are we still, you talked about it right at the beginning, why are we still doing this same process, hanging on to this process because we're comfortable with it, because, you know, for 80% of the time it works, and if we don't get the right person, well, there's so many others out there that we'll just find the next one, and we don't look at the cost involved of that changeover of personnel. You know, and at this level, it can be costly in all sorts of ways.
And I know we talk about, you know, cultural fit.
Yes.
When you're recruiting, how do you spend the time? How do you spend sufficient time to actually assess that cultural fit? And typically we go through a multiple series of interviews and try to assess that during 3 or 4 interviews maybe.
Yeah, which is a completely unnatural way of selecting someone, because no one's going to be talking generally about how they feel. You know, the biggest change to recruitment in my time was that we moved from just advertising a job to having selection criteria.
Right.
And you have to address the selection criteria. So everyone on their selection criteria says must be able to work in a team. So everyone says, I can work in a team.
That's right.
Just not very well.
Leave that part out of it, of course. Yeah, that's right. So how do you do that? How do you change what we do today in order to make that assessment more relevant and truer? And you should get it. I mean, if you're able to do that, quite obviously you get a much better result.
If we look at it broadly in terms of recruiting as a phrase, we start with kindergarten. They have an open day, so the kids can see what the school's like. They have a day where the kids stay there, so they see what it's like to be at school for a day. We do it with high schools, we do it with universities, have open days, we do it with work experience with kids. Now, I had a lolly shop for a long time, and I'd have kids in who'd think they would be clientele, and then they'd say, I'd really like to do my work experience here. And I'd say, well, it's very different when you're working here, you know, I'm not the nice lady behind the counter when you're working here. But for them to see in a week what it meant to be on the business side rather than the customer side, and to have to deal with the customers as well, often changed their minds about, sometimes that it actually instilled in them a desire to do something that was along those lines, and for others it was just, I can't do this, I can't, you know, I want to sit behind a screen, I don't want to talk to people for a week, I don't want to have to talk to people when I don't feel like it. And so for me and for them, because often I'd look at them as potential part-time employees as well. If I'd invested a week's worth of training in them, I wanted to see that there was some return for me as well as for them. So we do it in all of these stages, but when we get to sort of middle to upper management, it's all something that's hands off. Let's just talk to them behind the desk, and we won't do anything more.
I just want to get to the stage where we all believe that you're big enough, old enough, and therefore
we're mature enough now.
We're mature enough, and you supposedly have to assess the risk yourself. But from the other side, from the organisation's perspective, I think it's probably more important in terms of ensuring you get the right cultural fit. And how you do that through a series of 3 or 4 interviews, I don't quite understand myself.
You have to spend it a lot more about finding about the history of the person, and not just the referees that the person nominate. And that's always been tricky, because when people apply for a job, they nominate a referee, and you don't want to be talking to people where it's a confidentiality. You want to respect timing, confidentiality. But I guess there's no reason why organisations can't do what you mentioned as an individual. Talk to people who worked with you before. Talk to, you said, when I'm going to look for work in an organisation, as someone who worked there or is working there now. So when you're engaging an individual, you could say, has anybody I know through the network that worked with, say, Denis or Fulyana or Kim? What were they like in real life? Not the referee as such, but also so we can see results. But as a person, how do they behave?
I think it's really important is to get that additional information. And doing that from people who've worked with someone before is really good. Not necessarily just the direct referees.
Yes.
Well, the referee system was never reliable.
No, exactly.
Because who are you going to give as a referee? I mean, someone who's going to say how good you are.
Well, I had a coach mentor many years ago who and we spent a lot of time on this, and when you're trying to do some self-awareness stuff, where do you go, how do you behave in periods of stress? What is your leadership style when rubber hits the road and you're under stress and you're being pressured to deliver, so on and so forth? And that probably demonstrates the true underlying characteristics and values of an individual. If you could somehow mix that into deciding on a visual for a role, that would be great. Because it truly is. I mean, and it was the reason I was looking at that with this person was looking at it with me was also to get better self-awareness as to when those situations do come along, is recognise how you behave at a particular point in time, and therefore you might be able to adjust it.
You could ask that question at interview, though. What strategies do you use? Because you normally, as you said, you revert to type under stress. So what do you normally do? And give examples of that. For example, you know that if you're in a really not in the right frame of mind, you don't initiate certain meetings, or you reschedule certain meetings without inconveniencing others. But you want to be in top shape for a certain topic, and it's okay to sort of have a distance and step back a bit until you are, because you want to project at the best for you, for the company, and for your peers as well, and organisation.
The question that I find works really well for me in that process is the superpower one. So you say to them, what if you were a superhero? What power would you like to have? And the thinking that goes behind it is often quite revealing in the answer that they give, because it's not a question that they're expecting, it's not a question they've been asked before necessarily, unless I've interviewed them before, but it gives me a sense of how they think, often what they see as their shortcomings or areas that they would like to improve that they perhaps don't see as useful enough, or it'll give me some other insight into the way they think, basically. So, what's yours going to be? Dennis, now?
I take that one. It's good. One of the ones, I guess I'm along the same lines as Fulyana, is that, I do try to, during the interview process, is set up scenarios, actual scenarios that I've had to deal with in the past, and see what their reaction to that is, and try to probe on particular aspects of that, to try to force the issue, try to force the behavioural, to find out the behavioural trait.
Back to the comparing different organisations, did you find size or local or global made it easier or harder for decisions to be made? Does it take longer in one organisation than the other? How did that feel?
Look, as a general, maybe this is a general observation, certainly the very large organisations, some of the ones I've worked in, actually there's quite a difference. I work for a US corporation, multinational, very large. It had distributed delegation, if you like, so the regional centres were very influential. And at a country level, so long as you were doing okay, all the decisions were able to be made at a country level. Once things were not going so well, then it sort of escalated up. Whereas, compare that to a large Aussie organisation that I worked for, it was very bureaucratic. It took a long time to get decisions, to actually get those made. Those decisions were, decision-making process seemed to be fairly arduous.
So really, one should not generalise, is what you're
No,
saying. It
that's
depends
right.
on the organisation you're working
Correct.
in. And the key that you gave us before is try understand the culture
That's right.
and the processes they have, so that you can work with them and improve on them.
Yeah, look, it's really important to get that as early as you can on is how the decision-making processes work within the organisation.
Yes.
And again, you need to spend the time to understand that, because ultimately that's going to help you in terms of how you operate and how you go about the work that you've got to do. That is really important.
Is it a question you'd ask at interview?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it absolutely would be. No question.
Do you see that as a difference between industries, so that you have one industry or one sector that is more bureaucratic than others?
I can't actually make a comment. I'm afraid I haven't worked across that. The two industries I worked across, predominantly manufacturing and financial services, for the last 25 years. So, and again, earlier on I made a comment that at the time when I was working in manufacturing and I made the switch across to financial services, there was no question manufacturing at that time, their management processes, their management behaviours were far in advance of anything else around financial services. They had spent many years, they'd been in business for a very long time, and obviously had spent a long time. That particular sector had spent a long time, obviously, looking at those sort of things. And the way they actually progressed people through the organisation, it was very rare to actually sit in a role in that organisation for more than 2 to 3 years before you move into another. And they actually purposely target individuals, depending on their capability and calibre, in order to move them through the various parts of the business, so they get a very broad grounding, and then to see whether they actually had true leadership potential. So it was at that time, you're going back quite a while now, a very purpose-built approach to how they brought people through the organisation.
So have you seen, within the financial sector, services sector then, have you seen a change in leadership skills, business leadership skills?
Yeah, look, absolutely. It has changed. And in other areas it hasn't changed at all.
Okay.
So again, I agree with Fulyana. It's horses. There are some organisations that are very good at it and are able to take in new ideas and new things and able to take those and really make a real success of it, versus those that are very happy within the enclave that they've developed for themselves.
With all of the styles still survive?
Yeah, they do. I think there's no question they will survive.
And still find people who'll work with them whose skill set matches their approach.
Right. Exactly right.
I think sometimes with people listening, we don't want to make it appear as though we're saying this is the set of skills that you should have and this is the way you should move forward, because in your industry you won't get ahead in any other way. Yeah. So we still want people to recognise that they've got a skill set that might fit somewhere that they haven't thought of.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
So do you think for personal development and growth, is it better to work for more than one organisation than just work for the one? Or?
Again, originally I used to have that view, and then my view changes on that from time to time. I think it does help. I think there's no question that having the opportunity to go and experience another organisation, another culture, another way of doing things is incredibly valuable. I think there's a certain level of pragmatism and adaptability that has come along with that, and so you're able to adapt literally to new environments. You should be able to literally to new environments a lot easier. Having said that, there's also, you need depth of experience within a particular business as well. I don't think one particular way of doing things is always right. So having both mix, I think is very helpful. I think in an organisation, what you want is those who are well experienced, who've got the depth, who've been around some time, understand how it works, and then you inject that fresh blood, that fresh thinking, that hopefully those people who have had the diversity of experience in other organisations, if you can bring those two things together and meld them, then I suspect that's very powerful.
We are almost at the end of our time. Is there anything that we haven't yet covered in terms of business skills or places you've worked that is worth mentioning?
I think we've covered quite a few. The topics are, leadership is a topic that you can talk about for a very, very long time, and obviously a lot of people do. The other thing I was going to say was, I think along with changing styles of leadership and the fact that, we see old styles and new styles, I think the awareness of the importance of leadership, at least in financial services, I've seen that change over the past 25 years. The awareness of its importance, not just at the most senior level, but down through the ranks. I think that has definitely changed.
And identifying leaders then through the ranks?
Exactly. Yeah, that's changed.
Yeah.
I think that's that's a positive for the industry, I think as well.
Which is where probably the mentoring and the coaching comes into...
Well, you've seen a big difference. I mean, you go back 15 years ago, there was hardly any of that, really.
Well, it wasn't identified. I think we've talked previously about if we had a vision for ourselves, we looked for mentors. We didn't use the word,
that's right.
but we had coaches and we had mentors and we had...
people we'd seek advice from, exactly right.
Yeah, role models, all of those things.
Whereas now it's become more structured.
Very much more structured.
And therefore...
So that's another question that we generally ask our guests is what you see is the difference between mentoring and coaching.
Oh.
And then the second part of that question is a structured mentoring program or unstructured?
Well, again, I'm sorry, I'm horses for courses.
Yes.
I've seen where structured works, and I've seen, in fact, I've got a particular instance right now where unstructured is helping that individual. Really well. There are different levels of, instruction is there are different levels of formality. At one end of the spectrum, I think there's a real need for structured mentoring, and at the other, for those people who are a little bit more fluid, who are a little bit more maybe sort of dynamic, or maybe don't really know their path.
Yes.
Something that's a little bit more informal, unstructured is suits.
So the difference between coaching
and
mentoring.
Let me check the definition. Especially, I'm sitting here in front of Fulyana.
It's fine.
That wrong.
If I can't disagree with her once during a broadcast, then someone else has to.
Coaching for me is something specific. Is you're doing it to actually develop a particular skill set or whatever it happens to be. It's very specific in its nature. It is for a particular purpose. Mentoring, to me, can be very broad. And typically in the mentoring relationships that I've had, the first few meetings are incredibly, you're dealing with topics literally from one end of the spectrum to the other. And in time you may zero in on something, but typically you will then come back out and deal with some other aspect of your life, whether it be your work, whether it be personal, whether it be financial, spiritual, whatever it happens to be. So mentoring can be can be far broader, and it really depends on where the individual mentoree really ultimately wants to go.
And you need both.
Yeah. No question about it.
Fabulous.
There's a place for both.
Well, thank you for your time today, Dennis. We've certainly covered a range of
You're welcome.
ideas and thoughts. I'm Kim Bailey. She's Fulyana Osborne. We've been today with Denis Gambi. This is Inside Exec.